Hey guys, imagine standing in the heart of Babylon's greatest temple, the very walls trembling from the weight of secrets too terrible to speak. This is a ritual so shrouded in horror that even the gods themselves dare not whisper its name. Are you ready to face what lies beyond? Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. The moon hung low over the Tigris, casting a silver sheen across the sprawling city of Babylon. Lanterns glowed like fallen stars, flickering against the moist night air as whispers curled around narrow alleyways. Merchants had long since gone home, their stalls abandoned and silent, but here, at the heart of the city, life pulsed with an unholy rhythm. The great ziggurat of Marduk reached skyward, its terraces disappearing into shadow, and at its apex the high priest prepared for a rite both revered and reviled. The ceremony of the kashu, the terrifying ritual of male virgins in ancient Babylon, born to noble families yet destined for a fate darker than any battlefield. These boys, no more than 13 or 14, were led from their homes under the guise of honor. Smoky incense filled their lungs as they ascended the broad steps. They wore nothing but red cords around their waists, cords woven from sacrificial crimson threads meant to bind them to purity. Behind each red cord, though unseen by the crowd, lay fear so deep it threatened to consume their souls. In the outer courtyard, masked priests in lion-skin cloaks moved with deliberate grace. Their golden masks bore feral expressions, teeth bared in eternal snarl, and eyes that seemed to gleam with divine hunger. They chanted in a guttural tongue that rattled the bones of every listener. Their voices cut through the night, rising and falling like tidal waves of dread. No one questioned why the chant never faltered, but some said the rhythm was sustained by the terrified heartbeat of the boys themselves. The first chamber they entered was warm, heated by braziers that burned frankincense and sulfur. Steam curled along the floor in ghostly tendrils. Here, the boys knelt on stone plinths carved with ancient glyphs that promised protection but delivered only pain. Hands, calloused, merciless, bound their wrists behind their backs. The red cords were tightened, biting into skin, drawing fine lines of crimson where none had existed before. And as each boy knelt, blindfolded, the world narrowed to a single point of excruciation. They called this moment preparation, a purification by fire. Yet the instrument they used was neither fire nor oil alone, but a bronze hook, curved, wicked, blackened from countless rituals. The high priest, his mask reflecting torchlight, held the hook aloft. He smiled beneath the gold, a smile that shivered the spine of every witness. With deliberate slowness, he brought it down, hooking flesh and lifting ribbons of red. A cry tore from the boy's throat that echoed through the chamber, rattling ancient columns. The scent of iron and burning oil mingled with incense, creating a perfume of terror. For hours the ritual continued. Each boy endured his turn, the hook gliding over chest and shoulders through the soft flesh of thighs, never sparing a single nerve ending. The priests chanted without pause, their voices relentless, drowning out sobs and screams. Outside, the sounds of revelry drifted from the festival grounds, drums, laughter, the clink of wine cups. But within these walls, time ceased to exist. Pain was the only measure. When the final boy collapsed, sweat and blood mingling on the floor, the high priest declared the offering complete. He raised his arms and the chanting ceased as though the air itself had been cut. Silence fell, heavy as stone, pressing on the survivors like an unseen hand. The blindfolds were removed, revealing eyes wide with disbelief, pupils dilated in trauma. Some boys sobbed, others sat in stunned stillness, as though they were no longer truly there. These were the kashu, the pure sons of Babylon, no longer boys, but vessels for a power they barely comprehended. Carried down from the mount of the ziggurat, they passed through corridors lined with terrified acolytes who lowered their heads, unwilling to meet the hollow gaze of those who had returned. In the depths of the temple, they lay in cells of polished stone, cut off from sun and stars, fed nothing but baked barley and goat's milk. Here the true test began. days bled into nights with no distinction. The temple's architects had designed these chambers to muffle sound, but the walls themselves whispered secrets. Rats scurried through cracks, and the only light came from a single guttering lamp. Under its flicker, the boys waited. Some prayed. Others stared at the cracks overhead, memorizing the patterns as if it would save their minds from fraying. The high priests visited only to deliver meager rations or to administer a concoction of herbs intended to open the mind to divine visions. But these visions were nightmares, and the herbs were salves of madness. In the second week, the rites resumed. This time, the test was endurance. Each kashu was bound to a statue of Marduk, arms outstretched, wrists pierced by bronze hooks. They were left to hang until the blood slowed, until their bodies trembled on the brink of collapse. Below, priests watched and recorded every twitch, every flinch. A single tear was noted in sacred annals. Broken boys were set aside. The strong continued on. And from that crucible of flesh, the true kashu were forged, hollowed out, emptied of fear, reborn as living conduits for the god's will. Outside the temple, the city thrived. Scholars calculated the rise of stars, artisans gilded walls. But in the shadow of Marduk's ziggurat, a darker story unfolded. The kashu emerged from the trials irrevocably changed. Their voices, once bright with youth, now echoed with a distant void. Their eyes held a hollow light, as though something eternal had lodged within their souls. Some claimed they could hear Marduk's heartbeat beneath the stone. Others whispered that they spoke in tongues not their own. Yet for all their suffering, the kashu returned to the world above as icons of purity. They paraded through streets lined with cheering citizens, faces painted white, robes flowing like moonlight. Flowers rained down upon them. Wine flowed in celebration. Fathers wept with pride. Mothers cupped trembling hands to mouths that would never taste love again. Few noticed the staggering gait, the pallor of skin, the distant stare. No one asked what they had become. But within the sanctuary, behind locked doors, the survivors gathered. They compared scars by the flicker of hidden lamps, tracing each line with trembling fingers. They spoke of voices in the dark, of visions of serpents winding through ruined cities, of chanting that continued after the priests had gone. They realized that purity had become a prison and devotion a curse. And in those whispered confessions, the first seed of rebellion was planted, one that would grow in shadows, watered by the blood of the lost. This, then, is the tale you must remember, a story carved in flesh, bound in blood, whispered through centuries. In part 2, we will follow one kashu in particular, his name long erased, who dared to challenge the gods and the men who claimed to speak for them. His journey will take us beyond the gilded halls, through hidden passages, and into the very heart of Babylon's darkest secret. Stay with me, for the night is far from over. The torch's glow was the only light in the narrow corridor, a ribbon of amber flickering against damp stone walls. Our unnamed kashu pressed his palm to the cold masonry, every nerve alive with memory, the sharp scent of blood, the metallic echo of hooks, the whispered prayers that had become screams. He moved forward, each footstep muffled by a thin layer of dust, heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. He had awoken hours before dawn, in a cell beneath the ziggurat's lowest terrace. No lamp burned there, only the pale glimmer of moonlight seeping through a narrow slit high above. In that half-light, he had stared at his own reflection in the stagnant water pooled at his feet. Hollow eyes, skin drawn tight, the red cord scar still aching on his waist. It was there he first resolved to escape. Outside his cell, the temple slept in deceptive calm. The chanting had ceased, the priests had withdrawn to their private chambers, and only the faint drip of water echoed in the halls. Guided by a memory of hidden pathways, crumbled stairwells, and forgotten storerooms he had glimpsed during dizzying ceremonies, he slipped free of his bonds. The iron shackles were cold, but he wrenched them apart with the desperation of a man who knew he was already half dead. He crept past the great hall where the statues of Marduk loomed, colossal stone lions with eyes that once seemed to watch him. Now, in the shadow of rebellion, their vigil felt empty. Each step was a negotiation with fear, the fear of discovery, of recapture, of the unknown that stretched beyond these walls. Yet beyond fear lay purpose, an ember kindled by the memory of laughter, of sunlight on olive groves, of a life before sacrifice. As he turned a corner, he came upon a sealed door of cedarwood, the surface carved with flowery motifs and cuneiform inscriptions praising the god's mercy. He pressed an ear to the grain and heard muffled voices, the head priest lecturing acolytes on the next rites. Through a crack he glimpsed robes of white and gold, halos of incense drifting upward. He knew that if they discovered him now, they would drag him back into darkness, into chains far worse than iron. He had heard rumors of a secret passage running from the temple's bowels to the outer walls, meant for emergencies. A tunnel used once, centuries ago, during a siege that locked priests and sacrifices together for weeks. It lay beneath the western terrace, sealed by a slab of basalt that required both hands and resolve to move. He followed the whisper of memory, past the furnace room, its coals ash cold, past the pantry, its stores untouched, past the latrine chamber where the stench still clung. At last he reached the basalt slab. His hands were trembling, but he planted his feet firmly, braced himself, and shoved. The rock scraped against sand, and with a grinding groan it shifted enough to slip inside. Darkness swallowed him. He dropped through, limbs folding, and landed on hard earth. The stolen breath burned in his lungs as he rolled onto his side, then pressed himself flat, listening. The tunnel was low. He could only crawl, but it smelled of fresh soil, of rain that fell somewhere above. Tiny roots hung from the ceiling, like pale tendrils reaching down. Ahead, he saw a pinprick of silver light where the tunnel curved. Inch by inch, he advanced, aware of every scrape of stone on bone, every quiet shift of dust. Somewhere behind him, a rat scuttled. Somewhere ahead, a nightbird cried. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged into a small chamber. The floor was uneven, littered with broken pottery and bits of bone. A narrow shaft opened to the sky, moonlight pooling at his feet. He climbed toward it, fingertips scraping against the lip, and pulled himself up into a small courtyard overgrown with thorny vines. In the center stood a shallow pool, green with algae. For a moment, he allowed himself to taste freedom. He knelt by the pool, cupped the water in his hands, and let it wash over his face. The cold was electric, drawing a gasp from him. As he drank, he felt the bones in his face relax, the weight of centuries lift from his shoulders. But he could not linger. Beyond the courtyard wall, he saw the flicker of torches and heard the distant rumble of the outer gate. Guards. They had discovered his absence. He did not wait to learn whether they meant to pursue him. He climbed a broken staircase overgrown with ivy, emerging onto a rooftop terrace where the sprawl of Babylon lay before him. Rooftops like a sea of mud brick, illuminated by lamps, the ziggurat rising like a dark monolith at its center. He paused, watching the city breathe in its nightly rhythm, people celebrating the harvest festival, unaware of the terror in their midst. He pictured streets lined with dancers, felt the echo of drums that mingled with the baying of temple hounds. Somewhere out there, his family slept, believing him among the honored. He had sent no message. He could only hope they did not face the temple's wrath and reprisal. He dropped from the roof and raced along narrow alleys, guided by moonlight and instinct. Each corner held a new trap, a patrol of ox-drawn wagons, a pair of drunk celebrants singing bawdy songs, a child chasing a rat. He used them all. He ducked, he waited, he balanced on walls too narrow for 2 feet. His body screamed in protest, muscles torn from inactivity, lungs constricted by fear, but he pressed on. When he finally reached the outer wall, he was alone beneath the hush of open sky. He pressed his ear against the stone and heard the distant chant of priests, but there was no guard here. He followed the ramparts to a broken gate where the hinges had rusted through centuries of neglect. With a wrench that echoed across the night, he freed the gate and slipped through. The cool air of the desert night assaulted him, rich with the scent of date palms and distant caravans. Above, Orion shone like a beacon. The Pleiades burned bright. He raised his face to the stars, and closing his eyes and allowed himself a single moment of triumph. He was alive. He was free. But freedom came with a price. Behind him, the ziggurat's silhouette remained, a dark promise of power and pain. He knew the priests would hunt him. They would send men through every caravan gate, every caravanserai, every river crossing. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and the scar of the red cord. He rose and tucked himself into the shadows of a thorny grove. There, in the hush before dawn, he began to plan. He would find allies among the city's outcasts, the servant girl dismissed for her truths, the acolytes who doubted, 14 young men who had been broken in the rites but refused to wear the mask of the Kashu. They would meet here in secret, driven by a shared desire, to tear down the tyranny of Marduk's priests and expose the ritual for what it was, an instrument of control wielded by the powerful against those too young to fight back. As he traced the constellation of the bull with his finger, he whispered vows that would shape Babylon's future. The terror of the temple would echo no more. The screams would find a voice in revolt. The gods who demanded purity through pain would be named, called to account by the blood they had swallowed. And so the second chapter of this story ends, not with the clang of hooks, but with a silent promise beneath the stars. In part 3, we will follow the conspirators as they weave their rebellion, risking everything to challenge an empire's most sacred tradition. The night is still young, and Babylon's darkest secret is about to be unraveled. The desert dawn was still hours away when the conspirators gathered beneath the gnarled olive tree on the outskirts of Babylon. A crescent moon hung low in the sky, its pale light illuminating 14 hollowed figures, boys and young men hollowed by ritual, yet aflame with purpose. Our unnamed Kashu stood at their center, cloak drawn tight against the night chill, eyes glittering with determination. Around him hovered the servant girl, Miriam, whose whispered warnings had seeded this rebellion, and 3 acolytes, Dagon, the scholarly scribe, Ishar, the swift-footed messenger, and Sarped, the burly porter with fists like hammers. They formed a rough semicircle, and under the hush of palms the Kashu spoke. Tonight, we change everything. We strike where the priests think themselves untouchable, in the heart of their own temple. A murmur of assent rose. 4 months ago, each would have trembled at the very mention of reprisal. Now, they trembled with excitement. Gathering the threads. First, there was information to secure. Dagon had stolen the head priest's scrolls, minutes from secret councils, notes on ritual schedules, the names of every Kashu still in training. By memorizing their chapel routines, they could predict exactly when doors would be unlocked, when torches would be left unattended, when the temple's heartbeat slowed to a faint pulse. Next, they needed tools. Sarped had smuggled rusted iron nails, sharpened on river stones until they could pierce leather. Miriam had acquired spare cords of red thread, identical to the cords of purity, but dyed a darker hue. At the right moment, they would cut these into strips to bind the priests, turning the symbol of subjugation back upon its wielders. Finally, they needed an audience. The rebellion could not be hushed by threats or blood. They chose the festival of Tashritu when the city's devotion peaked and the ziggurat's great doors opened wide for the people. As thousands poured into the temple plaza, chanting and dancing, the conspirators would infiltrate its heart. Dusra, infiltrating the temple. Under the cover of night, 7 of them, Miriam, Dagon, Ishar, Sarped, and 3 Kashu survivors, slipped past the western gate's cracked hinges. The outer courtyard was deserted, and the carved lions leered like sentinels frozen in warning. Torchlight flickered in distant chambers. Footsteps echoed faintly as a midnight guard made his rounds high above. They melted into shadows. Using Dagon's maps, they navigated the corridors, past the storehouses where grain sacks lined the walls, past the brazier room, still red with coals, past the latrine chambers, where water trickled into silent pools. Each step brought them closer to the priest's private sanctum, a hidden annex of polished alabaster reserved for councils and conspiracies. At the door of the sanctum, Ishar knelt and worked a stolen key into the lock. It gave with a click. They slipped inside. The chamber was lit by a single oil lamp. Scrolls and clay tablets lay scattered on low tables. In one corner, the head priest's golden mask rested on a velvet cushion, its snarling expression curiously lifeless. Here, the conspirators paused. Sarped placed the iron nails on the table. Miriam leveled the sharpened cords. Dagon unrolled the scroll that listed the festival schedule, the precise moment when the high priests would ascend the ziggurat to offer the first blood sacrifice of Tashritu. "Midday," Dagon said. At the stroke of 12, A thin shaft of moonlight slipped through a narrow window high above, illuminating the mask. Our Kashu stared at it and felt a cold surge of defiance. Third, seizing the moment, over the following hours, they dispersed to their positions. Ishar crept to the northeast terrace, ready to disable the guard patrol. Sarped hid in the eastern archway, poised to ambush any priest who tried to sound the alarm. Miriam and 2 others took posts along the procession route, set to reveal the truth to the crowd. Arkashu and Dagan lingered beneath the grand staircase leading to the sanctum door. As dawn's first pale light touched the city, the festival began. Drums pounded from every alley, trumpets blared from rooftops. A sea of worshippers poured into the temple plaza. Women in veils, children with painted faces, merchants in fine robes, and peasants clutching garlands of dates. At mid-morning, the high priests emerged from the ziggurat. They wore white linen robes and golden masks, carrying the first sacrificial implements. The crowd hushed. A single cloud drifted overhead. Then, to the sound of a lone drum, they began their slow ascent of the great steps. It was time. Ishar sprang from his hiding spot, hurling stones at the guards, stones that rang against armor with startling clamor. The guards looked up, alarmed, scanning the shadows. As they took pursuit, Sarped leapt from his archway, slamming iron nails into leather straps of their jerkin, tripping them. 2 guards fell screaming, another ran off. Above, the high priests reached the ziggurat's top terrace. The crowd craned their necks. The sun had climbed higher. A soft breeze stirred. The drums faded. Silence pressed in like suffocating silk. From behind a column, Arkashu stepped forward, arms raised. In his hands he held the head priest's mask. He threw it at the golden feet of the chief priest. The mask clanged and skittered, and the priest recoiled as if struck. "Behold your god's grin, wrought by your own blood," he cried. His voice rang clear across the plaza. The chief priest's golden visage did not move. He tilted his head as if puzzled. And then, in a voice deep with authority, he spoke words that shattered centuries of silence. "Who dares defile the temple of Marduk?" "Those you have broken," the Kashu answered. He gestured behind him. From the shadowed stairway, Miriam and the other conspirators emerged, each holding severed cords stained dark as spilled wine. They chanted in unison, not in the priest's guttural tongue, but in the language of the people. "We bear witness. We protest the sacred horror cloaked in holy chant." At first the crowd stared, dumbstruck. Then murmurs rippled through the masses. Astonishment, confusion, dawning outrage. A merchant cried out, "What blasphemy is this?" A mother clutched her child. A young scribe asked, "Are these the ones they call pure sons?" 2 priests advanced on Arkashu, but Sarped and Ishar intercepted, binding their wrists with the red cord's turned weapon. The priest struggled, shouting for guards, but the guards lay injured or fled. The plaza erupted. The truth unveiled. Miriam stepped forward, voice trembling but strong. She recounted the secrets hidden behind locked doors, the bronze hooks, the blood-streaked plinths, the severed flesh offered in Marduk's name. She named the boys who had died unremembered, the acolytes driven mad, the scars seared into flesh and mind. She spat out every detail with such precision that no one could deny the horror. Crowds pressed in closer. Some wept, some raged. A potter grabbed a torch from a nearby brazier and thrust it into the golden mask of a fallen priest, sparks dancing as the mask melted in honeyed tears of bronze. Others seized ritual scrolls and hurled them into the dust. A group of musicians struck up a defiant tune, drums crashing in rebellion. The chief priest tried to speak, voice quavering beneath the weight of his unraveling authority. "This is sacrilege. You mock the gods." But his words were drowned by the roar of the crowd. Arkashu raised a trembling hand. "We do not mock the gods. We honor humanity." He looked toward the ziggurat's summit. "If Marduk truly demands purity through pain, let him answer for the suffering of innocents. Let him speak through the mouths of the living." Healed voices echoed his cry. The people surged forward, chanting his words. The priests, once untouchable, were dragged from their dais and cast to the crowd's mercy, their golden masks shattered under stone and boot. Their fine robes were stolen and burned in a pyre. Eindam, aftermath and a new dawn. By noon, the ziggurat's great doors lay ajar, its interior pillaged and desecrated. The pool of consecrated oil was drained into the streets, and its fragrance replaced by the acrid tang of smoke. The temple's treasures, gold, gemstones, sacred scrolls, were carried away by citizens who vowed never to let such tyranny return. On the plaza's edge, the conspirators stood bloodied, exhausted, yet triumphant. They watched the sun climb its zenith, the first rays striking the ziggurat's battered stones. Our Kashu removed the red cord scar from his waist by cutting the flesh around it, blood beading on his fingertips, a final act of liberation. He did not cry out. He simply tied a new coil of thread around his wrist, a knot of solidarity with his brothers. Miriam slipped beside him, touching his arm. "You did it," she whispered. He nodded, and for the first time in years he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. By nightfall, a council of citizens had convened in the ruins of the temple. They drafted new laws, prohibiting ritual mutilation, protecting children from priestly conscription, opening temple doors to all in need of healing and counsel. The office of high priest was abolished, replaced by a circle of elders elected by the people. The ziggurat itself would stand, a monument to history's lessons rather than unchallenged power. In the days that followed, new Kashu emerged, boys trained in healing arts, astronomy, and the songs of the people, rather than instruments of fear. They wore cords of pale green, symbolizing growth, renewal, and the fracturing of old chains. Our Kashu and his companions taught them, imparting both knowledge and empathy, ensuring that the past's horrors would not be forgotten and never repeated. And so Babylon breathed anew. The harvest festival continued, but now the drums celebrated life's mysteries rather than bleeding into madness. The city's heart beat stronger, forged in the crucible of truth, and rebelled from the abuse of sacred tradition. This is where our tale winds to its close, not with the cry of a boy on a plinth, but with the song of a people rising together. In Part 4, we'll explore the legacy of the Kashu rebellion, how the story spread beyond Babylon's walls, kindling revolts in distant lands, reshaping the very notion of divine power. For now, rest easy knowing that even in the darkest ritual, the spark of human courage can ignite a revolution. What if I told you that a single spark in the dead of night could ignite a revolution that would ripple across empires? 30 seconds of your time to imagine the world forever changed by the courage of broken boys, and the stakes have never been higher. The dawn after the uprising was cool and silent, the ziggurat's battered stones catching the first blood-orange rays of the sun. In the plaza below, citizens moved with purpose rather than ceremony, hauling away shattered masks, dismantling broken braziers, and stacking the priest's golden idols for a public bonfire. Our unnamed Kashu stood at the center, robes torn but spirit unbroken, as whispers of his name spread from lip to lip. But the true revolution was only beginning. First, seeds of rebellion in distant lands. Word of Babylon's Kashu rebellion traveled swiftly along trade routes, carried by caravans, sailors, and wandering bards. In the distant oases of the Arabian desert, Bedouin tribes paused in their endless march to hear the tale. How boys once bound by hooks in terror had seized the symbol of divine power and flung it at the feet of a god's proxy. Among those who listened were young poets and fierce desert warriors who had long chafed under the yoke of ritual oppression in their own tribes. They sent envoys to Babylon, seeking the exiled Kashu's counsel on overthrowing their own priestly overlords. At the mouth of the Red Sea, a Phoenician merchant named Hiram carved the story into a cedar plinth. His vessel, laden with purple dye and Tyrian textiles, flew to ports from Byblos to Carthage. In each harbor, citizens read of the fallen golden idols and the green-corded priests who rose in their place. Shipwrights whispered of building new temples framed by open arches rather than locked doors. Fishermen spoke of offerings of fish and grain instead of blood and flesh. The ripple had become a wave. Dusra, the new order of the green cords. Back in Babylon, the Council of Elders declared a new rite for the Kashu, a rite of enlightenment rather than obliteration. On the spring equinox, they opened the temple gates to all, nobles and commoners, men and women, old and young. Instead of hooks, there were scrolls of astronomy. Instead of isolation, there were public debates. The green cords worn by the initiates were woven from reeds gathered at the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, symbolizing resilience and growth. Each cord was knotted with intention, protection, empathy, wisdom. The inaugural ceremony drew tens of thousands. Soothsayers calculated that the 12 gods of Babylon had aligned in unprecedented harmony. In front of the ziggurat, our Kashu, now called Kashi, a name meaning voice, delivered the opening invocation. He spoke not in priests' ancient tongue, but in the common speech of Babylon's streets, reminding everyone that divine favor belonged equally to the humble bakers, the river guide boatman, and the blacksmith's wife. A hush fell as he removed his mask, no longer needed, and revealed eyes bright with hope rather than void. The third echoes in Egypt and beyond the revolution did not stop at Iraq's borders. In the fields along the Nile, a priesthood revered life-giving rituals of flood and sowing, yet still bound children in secrecy. Letters arrived from Memphis describing secret midnight gatherings of farmers, offering bread to the Kashu exiles in hopes of learning the new rite. In temples to Ptah and Sekhmet, statues of gods were repainted with scenes of emancipation, a boy breaking free from chains, a goddess extending a hand in mercy. Even the pharaoh's scribes recorded the jubilee for the Babylonian reformers in the royal annals. Farther east in the Indus Valley, traders who had once whispered of Babylon's cruelty now proclaimed the Kashu's enlightenment as a model for their own caste divisions. Clay seals depicted young men and women exchanging red cords for green, symbolizing a shift from status by birth to status by deed. Monasteries in the Himalayan foothills translated the Babylonian Manifesto, a collection of speeches, protests, and council decrees, into local dialects, integrating its ethos into a philosophy of compassion and communal responsibility. Fourth, reshaping the concept of power. Until the rebellion, divine mandate had been the unassailable cornerstone of law. Now, councils of elders, chosen by lottery from every quarter of the city, enacted civic ordinances based on debate rather than decree. The first law passed was simple. No child under 15 could be conscripted into any religious service without full consent and a public hearing. The second granted land rights to temple-trained Kashu, recognizing their sacrifices and knowledge as assets to the community, rather than property of the priests. Temples across Mesopotamia reimagined their architecture. Massive gates were replaced by open colonnades. Dark inner chambers gave way to sunlit courtyards. Priests became stewards rather than rulers, custodians of knowledge who taught healing herbs and astrological charts. Offerings shifted from blood to sustenance, grain, olive oil, and textiles given to ensure the welfare of the poor. Music and theater were integrated into worship, transforming liturgies into inclusive communal celebrations. Eindam, personal legacies, the Kashu of tomorrow. The last surviving members of the original 14 Kashu formed a guild of storytellers and teachers. Kashi himself wrote a treatise titled The Scars of Purity, reflecting on how pain can break the body yet illuminate the soul. His words traveled to Athens, where philosophers debated the nature of suffering and freedom, to the Persian Empire, where it influenced reforms by King Cyrus's successors, even to Sparta, where the laconic elders cited Babylon's example in tempering the brutality of their own rites of passage. Young initiates sought out these elders to learn patience, compassion, and critical thought. They studied under former acolytes, now masters of astronomy, medicine, and poetry. Their green cords were embroidered with the sign of the ibis, symbolizing Thoth's wisdom, and the lotus, representing purity emerging from darkness. Each new Kashu undertook a year of service in the community, teaching at schools, tending gardens, or caring for the elderly, before being recognized in the equinox ceremony. Initiation replaced mutilation. Shasti, the enduring flame of rebellion. Centuries passed, and Babylon rose and fell to new empires, Assyrian, Persian, Hellenistic, Parthian. Yet the legend of the Kashu rebellion endured. Even when the ziggurat crumbled to dust, pilgrims journeyed to the ruins to lay flowers at its base, honoring the boys who had turned fear into freedom. Scholars engraved their story on clay tablets stored in the library of Alexandria. When Rome's armies marched east, soldiers carried copies of the Scars of Purity, pondering the balance between order and cruelty. In the modern era, explorers uncovered those tablets and scrolls, igniting scholarly debates that still burn bright. Museums display the green-corded knot alongside remnants of those ancient hooks, an object lesson in how rituals can imprison or liberate. Anthropologists cite Babylon's Kashu rebellion as the first recorded instance of a successful popular uprising overturning a sacrosanct tradition. Poets and playwrights continue to draw inspiration from the tale, reminding us that even the most entrenched power can be challenged by the weakest voice. 7th, reflections on ritual, power, and humanity. What does it mean that a ceremony meant to purify became an instrument of torture, and that the same ceremony, once reborn, could heal a city? The Kashu rebellion teaches us that the truest measure of devotion is not to endure pain in silence, but to speak truth in defiance of terror. Rituals shape our identities, but only if we consent to them. When we question, transform, or abandon harmful rites, we reclaim our humanity. As you gaze upon the night sky tonight, remember the constellation of the bull that guided our Kashu to freedom. Remember the olive tree under which conspirators vowed rebellion. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And know that in every era, there are hooks waiting in the darkness, but there is also a spark capable of igniting hope. Thank you for joining me on this final chapter of our journey through Babylon's most terrifying ritual and its triumphant aftermath. If this story stirred something in you, let me know below. What ritual in your life deserves scrutiny? What tradition could be reborn through compassion? Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking truth, and remember, even the darkest ceremony can be rewritten by the courage of a single voice. Hey guys, what if I told you that in the ancient cities of Syria, young boys, some as young as 9, were willingly led into the heart of sacred temples, not to be honored, but to be mutilated in the name of the gods? 15 seconds. That's all you need to brace yourself for a journey into a ceremony so brutal that it reshaped destinies and empires. Ready? The night air hung heavy over Ugarit's grand temple of Baal, the scent of incense thick enough to blind the senses. Torches burned in bronze sconces, casting twisted shadows against walls carved with storm gods battling sea serpents. At the center of the courtyard, a wooden dais had been erected. Its surface was stained dark, ancient blood seeping into the planks, a grim memory of earlier rites. On that platform knelt a boy, blindfolded, his small frame trembling with both fear and strange anticipation. He was dressed only in a linen loincloth, his chest bare, the shock of his youth stark beneath torchlight. Surrounding him, robed priests in azure and gold chanted in a guttural tongue, voices rising and falling like thunder across the Levant. Their leader, a towering figure in a helmet shaped like a bull's head, stepped forward, carrying a curved obsidian blade so sharp it gleamed like a black mirror. The blade's edge had been tempered in sacred oils and cooled in spring water drawn from hidden mountain springs. It was said that only the purest steel could sever the ties between mortal flesh and the divine favor of Baal. This ceremony was called the Kubutu, the castration of the temple acolytes. To outsiders it sounded like a punishment. In truth, it was viewed as the highest form of devotion. The boys chosen for this honor came from families willing to surrender their sons to the temple. In return, the family would gain Baal's blessing, fertile fields, plentiful rains, protection from invading armies. Yet no one spoke of the cost, severing flesh to sever earthly ties, becoming neither man nor boy, but something other. As the bull-headed priest raised the obsidian blade, the boy's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, recalling his mother's tears as she handed him over days before. She had whispered, "You will serve the gods. You will be reborn." The boy had nodded, though he did not understand the weight of her words. Now, with every drumbeat echoing in his ribs, he felt an ancient ritual pulse through the temple, a rhythm older than any king or scribe. The blade descended. There was no scream, only a stifled gasp, a sound so soft it was swallowed by the incense-laden air. When the blade rose again, it did so without flesh, leaving behind the boy's innocence in a shallow bowl lined with flower petals. The priests caught the offering with reverent hands, anointing the blood with oils while chanting blessings that promised the boy's spirit would ascend closer to Baal's throne. He was lifted from the dais and carried behind heavy curtains into the inner sanctuary. where the walls themselves seemed to whisper secrets. Flickering lamps revealed murals, storm clouds splitting mountains, bulls trampling armies, and acolytes, once whole, standing before the god like ethereal guardians. Here, the newly initiated would be washed in perfumed waters, their bodies cleansed of mortality. From this day forth, they would be eunuchs of Baal, untouchable by earthly women, and immune to the distractions of flesh. They would devote every breath to prophecy, healing, and guarding the temple's hidden knowledge. But in the days that followed, the veneer of divine transformation began to crack. The eunuchs, once boys, found themselves isolated from the world. Their families, rather than celebrating, avoided them. Children hissed from behind walls. Women crossed the street to avoid their hollow stares. They wore silk robes and golden necklaces, a mockery of opulence that only served to highlight their loss. And though the priests praised them as conduits of revelation, the eunuchs felt only emptiness where desire once thrummed. Among them was a boy named Anat Ramu. He had been chosen not for status. His family was poor, but for a reported vision. On the day his mother gave birth, a bolt of lightning had struck the temple's altar without warning, a sign that the storm god claimed him. Anat Ramu had grown up listening to the priest speak of destiny and glory. When he knelt on the dais, he believed he was stepping into legend. Yet as he walked the marble hall into the sanctuary, he felt more like a ghost, his identity evaporating with each incantation. In the weeks after his initiation, Anat Ramu's days blurred into rituals. Before dawn, he joined other eunuchs in gathering sacrificial grain, offering it to Baal in bronze bowls. At midday, he read from clay tablets, interpreting dreams for pilgrims seeking fertility and wealth. At dusk, he performed dances in honor of the storm god's union with the earth, moving with solemn grace though his heart was a stone. Each task was a test of endurance, a promise renewed that his sacrifice elevated Syria's might. But Anat Ramu began to see patterns beneath the chants. He noticed that sometimes the drought would return despite the offering of fresh blood, that invaders would raid the outskirts of the city while the tenured priests reclined behind closed doors, counting their spoils. He observed that families who gave sons found themselves no more prosperous than those who kept them, and in the dead of night, he heard whispers among the guards. Some believed the castrations were less about divine favor and more about control. Boys removed from earthly ties, rendered obedient, and taught secrets that bound them eternally to the temple's will. One evening, as Anat Ramu sat alone in the courtyard, a tremor shook the ground. Candles flickered. A low rumble rolled from the horizon. The priests claimed it was Baal's voice, his thunderous decree of approval. But Anat Ramu knew better. It was the distant rumble of trading caravans heavy with grain, the lifeblood of Ugarit's economy. He thought of his mother, sewing linen in her tiny house, unaware that her son had become both weapon and prisoner. And in that moment, he understood the true price of the kubutu, not only flesh, but freedom, family, and the very spark of youth. The next day, Anat Ramu refused to join the morning procession. He stood at the temple gates as priests chanted. He turned to the crowd that gathered, farmers, artisans, children, and spoke with a voice that trembled yet carried. This ritual is not mercy. It is mutilation. We bleed, we suffer, and we are promised heaven. Yet the rains still fail, the enemy still raids, and our lives are stolen under the guise of the god's will. A hush fell. The priests rushed forward, their bull-headed leader drawing his blade. Anat Ramu raised his hand, silencing them. "Look at my brothers," he said, gesturing to the eunuchs who huddled behind him. "We are not gods. We are boys whose lives were severed. If Baal truly demands sacrifice, let him ask for grain, let him ask for oil, anything but this." The crowd murmured, torn between reverence and compassion. Some recoiled, others stepped forward, placing a hand on Anat Ramu's shoulder. In that moment, a spark of revolt ignited in the temple courtyard. A question whispered on the wind. Was the kubutu a door to the divine, or a chain on the living? That night, Anat Ramu met with a band of eunuchs beneath an olive tree on the city's outskirts. There were 7 of them, once boys with names, now numbered and nameless. They spoke in hushed tones of forging a new path, of reclaiming their stories, of demanding the right to live unshackled by the priest's obsidian blades. They planned to gather testimonies from families, to travel to nearby kingdoms and share their tale, and to challenge the very doctrine that justified their mutilation. But first, they would need proof. Anat Ramu vowed to infiltrate the inner sanctum, to find the records of Kubutu, lists of names, ages, offerings made, promises broken. If they could expose the hypocrisy, the ritual might crumble under its own weight. And so, under a star-strewn sky, the first seeds of rebellion took root among the eunuchs of Baal's temple. In Part 2, we will follow Anat Ramu's clandestine descent into the temple archives, the alliances he forms with sympathetic scribes, and the dangers he faces as he unravels the Kubutu's hidden ledger. We will witness how a single boy's courage can challenge centuries of devotion, and how the line between martyr and revolutionary is drawn in the blood of youth. Stay with me, for the story of ancient Syria's darkest rite is just beginning. The moon had not yet set when Anat Ramu slipped through the temple gate at the hour when the night guard's lantern swung low, and the sentries' voices had lulled to whispered monotones. He wore the heavy cloak of a visiting merchant's assistant, an ill-fitting garment purchased from Miriam at steep price, but it concealed the lean frame of a eunuch whose bones still ached from hooks and blade. In one hand, he carried a clay lamp, in the other, a folded strip of papyrus bearing the temple seal, a gift from the head priest that would grant him passage to the inner archives. Every footstep echoed against polished basalt floors so black they stole the lamp's light, leaving windows and niches as ink blots in the darkness. Anat Ramu's breath came slowly, measured. He counted each inhalation to steady his heart. He recalled the silent geometry of the corridors, the way a drip of water always fell 3 paces before the turn leading to the record chambers, the faint aroma of rosewater that hinted at the scribe's quarters, the soft hum of fermenting wine in the cellars below. Years of service, years of exile, had etched the temple's blueprint into his memory. As he passed the bronze braziers, long since cold, their charcoal gray beneath layers of dust, he heard a scuff of sandals ahead. He pressed himself against the wall, lamp raised just enough to create a slender puddle of light. 2 acolytes in white robes passed, speaking quietly of the dawn sacrifice. Their words drifted upward. Is the final clutch of the Kubutu schedule unchanged? Yes, the sacrifice must align with the equinox. Their steps died away. From beyond, the soft scrape of a turning bolt told Anat Ramu he had arrived. The record chambers lay beyond a pair of cedarwood doors, carved with scenes of Baal's victory over Yam, the sea demon. Anat Ramu held up his papyrus. A lone guard, a sullen youth no older than 14, glanced at the seal and nodded. The door swung inward, revealing rows of low wooden shelves laden with clay tablets and rolled scrolls. A single lamp burned on a bronze stand, its flame wavering as though uncertain whether to challenge the surrounding darkness. Anat Ramu stepped inside, heart pounding. He closed the door softly, pressing his ear to the grain. Footsteps crunched outside, another patrol, perhaps. He waited, breath held, until the sounds faded. Then he drew the cloak's hood forward and moved deeper into the room. At the center stood a low table strewn with scrolls. Anat Ramu set down his lamp and unwrapped the papyrus. He unfolded it to reveal the head priest's seal embossed in cinnabar, and in tiny, almost invisible script, a list of document titles and shelf numbers. Kubutu enrollment rolls, offering logs of years 12 to 15, correspondence with merchant guilds. This was the ledger of lives traded for divine favor. If he could copy or remove these records, the temple's secret would burn in daylight. He chose a narrow scroll labeled Enrollment Rolls, Sir 720 to 734. Leaning close, he traced cuneiform signs with trembling finger, a sequence of names: Anat Ramu, son of Hadu Ibel, age 10, Dagan El, son of Ishkun, age 12. Each line carried the boy's age and the date of his castration ceremony. Next to each, a tally of grain offerings credited to the boy's family. Some lines ended with scrawled marginalia in red ink. Died 1 month later, failed to receive boon, spirit unrested. The weight of those words struck Anat Ramu like a physical blow. He crouched, dipped a stylus into lamp-warmed wax, and began copying. His hand flew as the oil burned his palm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window's lattice. He paused only to glance at the map Miriam had drawn in his cell, an escape route routed through service corridors and a disused granary. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then, footsteps again. Closer. Anat Ramu froze, stylus poised mid-air. Through a narrow window high on the wall, he saw lantern light sweep across the courtyard floor. He snuffed his lamp, plunging the chamber into darkness. The scrolls and clay tablets became pale ghosts in the gloom. He pressed himself to the far wall, listening as the guard's boots clicked across the stone. A voice called in a whisper, "You there, open up." The young guard's tone was abrupt, impatient. "The head priest needs the offering logs, now." Anat Ramu recognized the guard's voice. Aharu, one of the few eunuch-friendly soldiers appointed to fetch records. Anat Ramu awoke the lone lamp and stepped forward, bowing. "I am coming, master," he called, voice low. Aharu's face appeared at the door, torchlight flickering over his sallow features. "Hurry," he hissed. "They're staging the morning rites. The head priest wants the records before the sacrificial meal. Then he'll review the Kabutu report." Aharu ducked inside, scanning the shelves with practiced eyes. Anat Ramu handed him the scroll he'd copied, pretending to have found it among the offering logs. "Here," he said, "for the king's records." Aharu thumbed through the characters. "Correct?" he muttered. He folded the scroll and tucked it under his arm. "You may go." He slipped out, leaving Anat Ramu alone with his copied ledger. The door clicked shut. Anat Ramu retrieved the map, tucked the sealed copy into his cloak, and blew out the lamp. He crept back the way he came, the papyrus fragment burning a hole against his chest. At the first fork in the corridor, he paused. Left would lead him toward the kitchens. Right would return him to the courtyard. Miriam had instructed him to use the kitchen passage, less guarded but rife with rats and rotten refuse. With slow, sure steps, he turned left. The corridor narrowed, and the air turned thick with the stench of stale grain and spoiled vegetables. Overhead, rotting beams dripped condensation. Anat Ramu's cloak caught on the jagged edge of a wooden beam. He tore it free and pressed onward. A low grate in the wall led to the kitchens. Through its slats he heard the clatter of pots as a single cook, a wizened old woman, prepared the day's offerings. Anat Ramu paused by the grate but dared not speak. He pressed on until the corridor ended at a heavy door of unvarnished pine. Miriam waited on the other side. Her lantern glowed like a distant star. "You have it?" she whispered. Anat Ramu drew the papyrus free. "Every name, every date." She exhaled. "Then we move." She led him down a flight of stone steps into a vaulted chamber, once a cistern, now half filled with stagnant water and stacked amphorae. A narrow tunnel ran deeper into the earth, the old sewer channel that linked the temple's underbelly to the city's main drains. If they timed it right, the turning tide in the river would flush them out at a distant manhole outside the city walls. They advanced single file, slipping through the pitch-black tunnel, water lapping at their ankles. Every drip of moisture on the vaulted ceiling sounded like thunder. Anat Ramu kept his hand on the damp wall, recalling Miriam's directions. 15 steps, then a turn to the left, then a bend at a broken joint. He counted each step in the darkness. At the broken joint, their lantern's flame illuminated a rusted iron ring bolted into the stone. Miriam reached back, clasped his shoulder. "This way." She turned, and Anat Ramu followed her through a narrow gap, emerging into a small drain chamber. Beyond, he could hear the rush of water mingled with the distant clink of river barges unloading grain. He stooped and slipped through an iron grill. They tumbled out onto a muddy riverbank just beyond the temple precinct. The moon was dipping below the western horizon, stars paling in the dawn. Anat Ramu inhaled the cold air, tasting salt and river silt. He folded the papyrus into his tunic. "Now we spread the names," he said, voice fierce with purpose, "to every merchant, every caravan guard, every city council in Syria and beyond." Miriam nodded. "We will print clay tokens with each name. We will show them to families, to scribes, to kings. We will name each boy, each age, each broken promise." She paused. And when the priesthood demands our silence, we will answer with every voice across the land. As they melted into the shadows of the palm grove, Anat Ramu felt the burden lift. The ledger no longer bound him as prisoner. It fueled his resolve. Behind them, the temple gate stood silent, guarding secrets that would soon blaze in the sun. In part 3, we will follow the uprising sparked by those clay tokens, how Anat Ramu and Miriam rally sympathetic scribes in Aleppo, Palmyra, and Ras Shamra, how the eunuch story ignites city councils to ban Kubutu, and how the priests of Baal fight back, deploying spies, assassins, and dark prophecies. The conflict will test their courage, their bonds, and the very gods they once served. Stay with me, for the storm is gathering, and the river of revolt cannot be turned aside. The journey to become a Gallus was not merely a physical ordeal. It was a descent into an entirely different life, a transformation of not just body, but of spirit, status, and identity. The boy who had once laughed under the sun, who had once cried in his mother's arms, was now gone. What remained was a being refashioned for the gods, neither fully man nor wholly divine, but something in between, drifting through sacred spaces and shadowed alleys alike. After the castration came the garments. Silks dyed in the deepest purples and fiery reds were draped over their healing bodies. Their hair, once cut short in boyhood, was now allowed to grow long, curled, and perfumed with imported oils. Their faces were painted with pigments ground from minerals, white lead to soften the skin, crushed cinnabar to stain the lips, charcoal for the eyes. They became creatures of beauty, eerie, delicate, otherworldly. In the markets of Emesa, Heliopolis, and other Syrian cities, they walked differently. They were not the poor, broken, discarded boys of yesterday. They were now the chosen ones, the priests of Atargatis, the beloved of Cybele. Their hips swayed with ritual grace, their wrists adorned with bangles that rang like wind chimes, but behind every gesture, every step, was the memory of pain. And somewhere, deep in the hollow where their masculinity once lived, was the silence that followed the scream. They lived in sacred enclosures, great stone courtyards surrounding inner sanctuaries, where outsiders rarely entered. There were altars stained from centuries of sacrifice, of animals, yes, but also of something else, something older, something more human. At night, when the temple fires burned low and the stars flickered overhead, the galley would chant, dance, and fall into ecstasy. They would whip themselves with knotted cords, gash their thighs with blades, and roll in ashes as drums pounded like thunder from the deep earth. This was not madness. This was worship, and in these rituals the pain was a bridge, a rope stretched across a chasm between the mortal and the divine. It was through pain that they entered trance, that they spoke in the voices of the gods, that they prophesied the futures of kings and the fates of empires. Women came to them for fertility blessings, men came to them for secrets of war and trade. Even Roman officials, skeptical of Eastern rites, sometimes watched with uneasy fascination. But their power came at a price, because though they had become vessels for divine energy, they were also no longer seen as fully human. The people revered them and feared them. They were sacred and untouchable, or so the myth said. In truth, some were used. Their beauty, strange, exotic, neither male nor female, became a lure for powerful men who wanted something no Roman woman or Greek boy could give. They were sometimes kept in hidden rooms, silenced by golden chains, touched only in darkness. Their bodies were considered impure by some, divine by others, and when the temple was closed for the night, their sacredness did not always protect them. The irony was sharp. They were made eunuchs for the gods to purify them from earthly desire, yet they became objects of insatiable curiosity. Their voice, if it returned, was high and haunting. Their movements, feminine yet awkward, drew stares in both admiration and mockery. They could no longer father children, but they were believed to carry the power to grant fertility to others. They could not consummate love, yet they spoke for goddesses of love and birth. In the city of Hierapolis, one of the great centers of Atargatis worship, the Galli were rumored to walk barefoot over burning coals, their feet protected by divine will. They would dance until they collapsed, seized by the spirit of the goddess, speaking in tongues no one understood. Sometimes, in the frenzy, one would begin to bleed from old scars that had never fully healed. And then there was the pool. Behind the temple lay a sacred water basin, cold, dark, and ancient. It was said that if a Gallus lay in the pool overnight, he would dream of the goddess. Some claimed to have seen visions of past lives. Others wept uncontrollably without knowing why. One legend told of a boy who entered the pool after his first ritual and emerged in the morning with white hair, his eyes blind but his tongue gifted with prophecy. Not all survived their first year. Some bled too much and died in fever. Some went mad from isolation and visions. Some were discarded when they became too quiet, too broken, no longer able to dance. But those who endured were elevated. They became elders of the cult, guardians of forbidden knowledge. They kept the records, on clay tablets and strips of cured leather, of ancient hymns and dreams and divine punishments. Among themselves, they told different stories than those recited to the public. Stories of the first Galli said to be divine youths castrated by the gods themselves. Stories of a time before the Romans, before the Greeks, when Atargatis still walked the earth as flesh and took human lovers who bled in her name. Stories of a secret underground chamber where a black stone, smooth and cold, pulsed with the heartbeat of the goddess, and where the first eunuch bled into its cracks, giving it power. They passed these tales like whispers, like incense smoke. Even among the Galli, few had seen the stone. It was said to live under Hierapolis, guarded by a veiled priestess who had not spoken in 40 years. And the Gallus who did see it never returned quite the same. But above ground, the rituals continued, the sacrifices, the dances, the prophecies. And with every new generation, new boys were chosen. Some from slavery, some given by families desperate to please the gods. The blades were sharpened, the chants prepared, the purple silks waiting in silence, because the gods still demanded their price, and the temple never slept. The centuries passed and empires rose and fell around the temples, where the Galli lived and bled and danced. The gods they served faded from the lips of kings, but the rituals remained, hidden, muted, half-remembered in whispers beneath the marble floors of new churches. In the early days of Roman rule, the cults were still tolerated, exotic curiosities in the eyes of imperial governors. The Galli were permitted to perform their rites in public, though not without judgment. Roman masculinity was harsh and narrow, and a self-made eunuch was seen as a violation of every norm. Many Romans mocked the Galli openly, calling them unnatural, perverse, indecent, but behind closed doors, some powerful men still came to the temples. They did not come to mock, they came for blessings, for prophecy, for the thrill of something sacred and strange, for something they could not find in their cold marble gods. And so, the Galli endured, in Emesa, in Hierapolis, in the shadowed ruins of Baalbek. They endured, but the world was changing. The winds that once carried the scent of incense and blood from the temples of Atargatis now carried the distant echoes of a new religion, one born not in marble sanctuaries but in desert caves, one that spoke not of many gods but of one God who demanded purity, not through ritual pain or ecstatic frenzy, but through belief, obedience, and control. Christianity was spreading, and with it came a fear of the old gods, the old ways, the old blood. The Galli, once feared and revered, became targets. Heretics, pagans, possessed. Some were rounded up and burned in public squares. Others were driven out into the desert, where they wandered like ghosts, draped in their faded silks, their feet blistered, their chants echoing into nothing. The sacred temples were seized, statues were toppled, pools drained, altars smashed. The black stone beneath Hierapolis was sealed in brick and buried beneath the floor of a church. The priestess who guarded it was never seen again. In Rome, the Emperor Constantine outlawed public castration, and though the practice did not vanish overnight, it was driven underground, out of sight, out of memory. But memory is a strange thing. It lingers. In remote corners of Syria, shepherds would tell stories to their children, of pale figures who wandered the hills at dusk, singing in voices too high for men, of stones that wept blood when touched, of boys who disappeared at spring festivals, only to return a year later dressed in robes and speaking in riddles. Some said the Galli never died, that the pain they endured made them immortal, not in body, but in story, in silence, in myth. Centuries later, when Christian monks began to write about the ancient world, they found fragments, clay tablets in forgotten languages, wall carvings depicting dancers in flowing robes, holding knives. A half-erased inscription near the Euphrates, "Blessed is he who bleeds for the mother." And deeper still, beneath layers of time and dust and conquest, were the bones, buried in temple courtyards, small, fragile, scarred. Archaeologists could not always explain them. The shape of the pelvis, the thinness of the jaw, the absence of adult male traits. They labeled them ritual burials, or dismissed them as anomalies. But the bones told a story, they always do, of a world where gods demanded flesh, and boys gave it, of temples that echoed with music, laughter, and screams, of dancers whose bodies were broken and remade in the name of ecstasy, purity, and divine love, of a time when suffering was sacred, and pain was the path to heaven. The story of the gala is not one of villains or saints, it is one of boys caught between worlds, boys who were taken and reshaped, boys who became something else, something holy and terrifying and unforgettable. Today, the temples are ruins, the statues worn down by rain. The black stone, if it still pulses, does so in darkness. But the story remains, etched in whispers, trapped in bone, waiting, always waiting. It began with silence, not the silence of sleep or serenity, but something colder, heavier, the silence of stone chambers beneath the earth, where footsteps were muffled by velvet and secrets. A silence broken only by the sound of breath, shallow, trembling breath, drawn into lungs that had not yet learned the shape of fear. In the upper halls of the palace, candles flickered in silver sconces, and laughter drifted like perfume through painted corridors. There, the princesses wore silk and walked barefoot on imported rugs. There, the priests offered honeyed prayers to gods with golden names. But beneath the tiles, far below the gardens and the pillars and the perfumed air, was a different world. The chamber had no official name. No door led to it directly. You could not stumble upon it or pray your way to it. It existed in whispers, in the hushed tones of servants who had seen too much, and in the crooked symbols scratched beneath crumbling stairwells. They called it many things: the first room, the crimson sanctuary, the unmaking cell, but most simply called it the hidden chamber, and those who knew, truly knew, what it was, never spoke of it aloud. It was here that the daughters of kings were sent on the night before their wedding, not for celebration, not for prayer, for preparation, for breaking. A bride, after all, was not born ready. She had to be shaped, softened, opened. This was the belief, the ritual, the law. No one remembered exactly when the chamber had been built. Some said it predated the palace itself, that it had once been part of an older temple, long since buried, dedicated to gods that even the priests no longer dared to name. Others claimed it had been ordered by a queen who lost her own daughter to a brutal wedding night, and vowed that no girl of royal blood would suffer unprepared again. Whatever its origin, the chamber remained, hidden, cold, waiting, and now it waited for her. She was 17, cloaked in white, with a gold chain woven through her braided hair. Her eyes were wide, not with innocence, but with the terrible clarity of one who knows the future is not her own. 2 women escorted her, older women with stiff faces and hands that trembled only slightly. They said nothing as they led her through the hallways she had never walked before, past doors that had no handles, past walls with no torches, past staircases that seemed to spiral forever downward. The last thing she saw, before they removed her veil, was a carving above the arched entrance. A flower split in half, its petals dripping. The chamber smelled of rose water and iron. Its walls were lined with velvet panels to muffle sound. No echoes here, no voices escaping. At the far end was a low platform, draped in dark silk. On it, a mattress. Next to it, a table holding oils, cloth, and a slender wooden object shaped like a tapering horn. The girl did not cry. Not yet. She had been taught that tears were shameful. But her breath had begun to shorten, and her pulse quickened as the women turned to her. They said the words they were required to say. Ancient words, hollow words, words meant to invoke protection and purity and divine readiness. The girl heard none of them. Her mind was elsewhere, on the man who would be her husband, whom she had seen only twice. A man 3 times her age, whose beard was streaked with white and whose smile never reached his eyes. Then the ritual began. The women undressed her slowly, methodically, folding each piece of her clothing as if it mattered, as if it deserved reverence. Her skin, exposed to the chamber's cool air, prickled. Her legs, unbidden, trembled. The oils came next, warmed in bowls, rubbed into her thighs, her hips, her stomach. It was meant to relax her, to make the body pliable. But the body knew better. It stiffened, it recoiled. It remembered that softness is often punished. Then, the touch, the probing, the intrusion disguised as tradition. This was the moment every bride feared, the moment when the veil of childhood was stripped not from the face, but from the flesh. The women worked in silence, their expressions unreadable. Perhaps they had been here once themselves. Perhaps they had been broken in the same room, beneath the same velvet, beneath the same carved flower that dripped stone petals above the door. There was no blood tonight, not yet. That would come later. For now, it was about creating space, creating silence in the body, just as there was silence in the chamber, making her empty, so that she could be filled. When it was over, they dressed her again, new garments, tighter, stiffer, a sign that she was no longer untouched, no longer the same. They did not speak to her. They simply led her out, step by step, up through the stairs that wound like a snake, through the halls where no sound was permitted, back to her room, back to the world that would never again see her as whole. She sat on her bed, eyes forward, hands in her lap, and only then, when she was alone, did the tears come, silent, endless, as though the chamber had not taken her voice, but simply moved it somewhere deeper, somewhere inside. There were no bruises. That was important. The chamber was designed to leave no marks, at least not where they could be seen. No broken skin, no torn flesh, just a dull ache between the legs and a deeper one, nestled where no physician could reach. At sunrise, her maids entered as if nothing had happened. They spoke softly, as they always had. They bathed her as they always had. But something had changed. They did not meet her eyes. She noticed it immediately, how their gazes darted to her feet, to the water, to the folds of her robe, as if she had become something other, as if she now carried a sacred shame that might spill from her skin if touched. And she understood. The chamber was not a place. It was a threshold, and once you crossed it, you could never go back. The wedding was scheduled for that evening, a royal union, lavish and calculated. Her future husband was a duke, a man with estates, soldiers, and rumors. It was said he had once beaten a mistress so savagely that she birthed stillborn twins. It was said he kept a boy in chains beneath his summer home. The girl did not care whether the stories were true. Truth, she now knew, was often less important than silence. As the servants prepared her, layering her in lace, powdering her cheeks, fastening the jewels around her neck, she watched them with a strange detachment, as if her body had already been buried, and she hovered just above it, watching a corpse be dressed for ceremony. The bells rang. Trumpets sounded from the towers. She walked slowly, each step rehearsed, down the marble corridor toward the sanctuary of vows. Her father waited there, dressed in crimson robes, hands folded with pious gravity. The priest, too, waited, and beside him, her groom, tall, cold, watching her with the casual indifference of a man inspecting a horse he already owned. She lowered her head. She knelt when told. She recited the vows she had memorized since childhood, the words she had once whispered in play with dolls. But now they tasted like iron. The ceremony ended, the veil was lifted, the crowd applauded, doves were released, musicians played, wine spilled. But in her mind the chamber still pulsed, as if it had followed her, as if a part of it had embedded inside her like a splinter that could never be removed. That night the bed was soaked with flowers. Her husband drank deeply, then undressed without urgency. He was not cruel, not openly, but his touch was not gentle. It was the touch of ownership, of expectation. When he entered her, he paused. "You've been prepared," he said flatly. She said nothing. He did not ask who had done it. He did not need to. Every man of rank knew of the chamber. It was never discussed, but all had benefited from it. Some, it was whispered, had even visited it themselves, watching, choosing, instructing. When it was over, he rolled away and fell asleep almost instantly. She lay beside him, eyes wide in the dark, staring at the carved ceiling above, and she thought, how strange that something so violent could be so quiet. Weeks passed, then months. She performed her duties, smiled when required, bled monthly, received gifts, wrote letters, attended court. She did not return to the chamber, not physically, but in her dreams she was always descending the stairs, spiraling deeper and deeper into velvet-lined shadows, hearing the slow creak of silk-covered wood, the warm scent of rose and sweat, the soft clink of metal bowls. She tried once to speak of it, to her sister, who was not yet betrothed. They sat by the window, embroidering birds they would never see. She leaned close and whispered, "Do you know what happens before the wedding?" Her sister looked up, startled. "You mean the prayers?" "No," she said softly. "Below the palace, the room, the women." Her sister stared at her, the color draining from her cheeks. Then she shook her head and said nothing more. That was how it worked. No one warned the next girl, because silence was not just a symptom, it was the disease. Eventually, the queen summoned her. It was a rare honor. She had only spoken to the queen a handful of times, each exchange formal and brief. But now she was ushered into the royal solar, where the queen sat in a gown of black brocade, surrounded by caged canaries. "You have adjusted well," the queen said, not looking at her. "Thank you, Majesty." "You are not pregnant." "No, Majesty." The queen turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "That will change." She bowed her head. The queen studied her, then, after a pause, said, "Do you remember the chamber?" The girl's breath caught. "I do." The queen nodded slowly. "Most women try to forget it, but some of us choose to remember." A strange silence fell between them, not cold, not empty, but heavy, like two mirrors facing each other. The queen motioned toward a velvet curtain at the far end of the solar. "There are books," she said, "records, stories, instructions. They are not for men." "Yes, Majesty." "You may read them, when ready." And just like that, she was dismissed. The girl returned to her rooms. That night, she did not sleep. She did not dream of the chamber. She dreamed of the queen. And for the first time, the chamber did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. The velvet curtain was heavier than it looked. When she drew it aside, the smell hit her first, not of dust or rot, but of lavender, of old parchment, of candle wax, and something faintly metallic, like a memory sealed in iron. Behind it, the room was smaller than expected, just a narrow study with shelves lining 3 walls, each stacked with leather-bound volumes too plain to be noble, too neat to be forgotten. She stepped inside and pulled the curtain closed behind her. Silence folded in like a cloak. The first book she opened had no title. Its pages were written by hand, ink slightly faded, strokes elegant but clinical. It began not with a prayer, but with a diagram, a sketch of the female body labeled in Latin and French, annotated with notes about elasticity, temperature, and pain thresholds. She turned the page, then another. Some of the books were medical, filled with theories and treatments for bridal tightness or maiden's terror. Some were diaries, painfully detailed, personal, bleeding between the lines. She found one written by a woman who had died before marriage, of infection. Another, written by a duchess, chronicled her decision to have her daughters prepared early, so that no noble blood might suffer on her wedding night. Each book carried its own voice, some trembling, some resigned, some horrifyingly calm, but they all returned to the chamber. It had different names depending on the century. The Red Room, the Preparation Hall, the House Below, the Matron's Sanctuary, and always it was hidden, not just beneath the palace, but beneath the skin of society itself, built into the bones of power, walled off by silence and ritual. No one ever said outright what happened there, but it did not need to be said. Some spoke of it clinically. Others wrote in metaphors, calling it the flower crushing, or the breaking of the seal, or the death before the first birth. In one passage, a woman described it as the wedding before the wedding, the true one, the secret one, the one we endure, alone and are forbidden to remember. The girl read until her eyes blurred. She returned every day for weeks. She read in secret, by candlelight. She memorized phrases. She traced old letters with her fingers. She copied names. And slowly, she began to understand. The chamber was not just a room. It was a lineage, an inheritance, a curriculum of silence passed down through centuries, not to protect women, but to preserve obedience, to train them to split their souls before they were asked to give their bodies. And yet, among the pages, she also found resistance, tiny rebellions, a woman who had refused to cry out, forcing the matron to strike her, another who had bitten her own tongue to leave blood on the sheets, so her husband would believe he was the first, and one simply signed E, who had seduced the groom's younger brother and escaped the country dressed as a priest. She began to dream of E every night, sometimes in a carriage, sometimes on a ship, sometimes running barefoot through snow with a dagger in her hand. She began to wonder, had E survived? Had she been found? Had she ever returned? In court, the girl now stood taller, spoke less, listened more. She learned how to observe men, how they lied when speaking fondly of their wives, how their eyes shifted when discussing war or marriage alliances. She noticed who laughed when the word virgin was mentioned, who went quiet, who watched her when they thought she wasn't watching. One evening, at a banquet, her husband made a crude joke about training his mare. The room laughed. She did not. She looked him in the eye, calm and cold, and said, "You've always been better at breaking horses than raising heirs." The laughter stopped. Her husband's face stiffened. He said nothing, just raised his cup and drank. Later that night, he did not return to their chamber. She did not mind. She had begun to bleed again, but this time it came with pain, sharper, lower, deeper. She sent for the midwife in secret. The woman arrived at dusk, veiled and silent. She examined her carefully, then stood back. "There was a child," she said softly. "No longer." The girl nodded. She did not cry. Instead, she asked for paper, and that night, by candlelight, she began to write. Not poetry, not prayers, a record, her own. She described the chamber, not with metaphors, but with truth, the table, the scent, the shape of the iron instruments, the voice of the matron, the silence afterward. She did not spare herself, but she did not spare anyone. And when the first page was done, she turned it over and kept writing, page after page, night after night. By the end of the month, she had filled an entire volume. She bound it in black silk and hid it beneath the floorboards of her study. Then she began another. She did not yet know who would read it, but she knew someone would, because the chamber, she now understood, had survived only because its victims had always whispered, always wept, always waited. She would not whisper. She would write, and that was the first step in burning it down. Years passed, not in peace, but in quiet. The girl, now a woman, now a duchess, now the matriarch of a house that had once feared her silence, had changed her world in ways that could not be measured by coronations or public honors. Her name was rarely spoken aloud in court. Men referred to her in lowered voices, calling her the cold one, or the widow who does not weep. She did not correct them, let them believe what they needed to. What they did not know, what they could not see, was that while they fought wars and played games with crowns, she had been waging another kind of war. One fought not with swords, but with secrets. One that bled not through the body, but through memory. Beneath the estate, the hidden library had grown. Books once buried or burned had been quietly restored. Letters once forgotten had been smuggled in from monasteries, private vaults, even the cellars of former mistresses. She built a second chamber, but not like the first. This one had no iron table, no scent of crushed violets, no veiled matron with quiet hands. It was a sanctuary of truth. Women came in secret, some noble, some not, daughters of merchants, wives of generals, maids who had once scrubbed floors and now walked the corridors of power. They came trembling, many of them, but they left standing taller. Because here, within this new chamber, they spoke, they read, they named the pain. And once something has a name, it cannot remain a ghost. In one corner of the room, the black-bound books she had written sat on a shelf, numbered and wrapped in cloth. A few women had copied them by hand, passing them beyond the estate's walls. One found its way into a convent in the mountains. Another appeared in a private collection in Venice. A third was rumored to have been delivered, by glove and carriage, to the queen herself. No one could prove it. But a year later a new law appeared, subtle, buried in a scroll, written in the language of property and inheritance. But it changed the way virginity was treated in royal contracts. Girls were no longer examined. That alone would have been enough. But the woman did not stop. She raised her own daughters differently, taught them that their bodies were not debts to be paid, taught them that silence was not dignity. And her sons too were taught that strength was not in conquest, but in protection, that no crown, no title, no bloodline was worth the breaking of another soul. She did not teach them to be good, she taught them to be just. But the world did not change overnight. Whispers continued, new brides still bled. Some families still paid the matron in secret to prepare their daughters for royal beds. But the difference now was that those women knew. They knew it was wrong. They knew it had been designed, and they knew they were not alone. One winter, long after her husband had died, the woman received a letter with no seal. Inside was a single line, "I found your book." No name, no return address, only a drawing, small, precise, tucked into the corner of the parchment. It was the diagram from the first book she'd read, the sketch of the female body labeled in Latin, but the lines had been altered. Where once there were measurements and notes on pain, there were now words written in a dozen languages. Truth, fire, begin again. She read the line once more, and she smiled, because now she understood. The chamber was not destroyed by fire or flood or decree. It was dismantled by memory, by rebellion, by women who, once broken, had chosen not to vanish, but to write. And she, once the girl behind the curtain, once the bride with trembling hands, had become the architect of its undoing. They would never write songs about her. She would never have a statue. But somewhere, far beyond her estate, another girl would one day stand before a wedding bed and not be afraid, and that would be enough. They say that when the sun begins to sink behind the ziggurats of Babylon, the river whispers secrets that only the old priests can hear. And in that hush of fading light, when the date palms sway like silent watchers, a strange procession once moved through the alleys of the sacred quarter, hooded, barefoot, and bound by vows older than memory. Among them walked a boy, 13 years old. He had been laughing just the day before. Then he was gone. The city was a marvel of its time, bustling markets echoing with shouts in Akkadian, the scent of crushed myrrh and roasted lamb heavy in the air, and towers reaching toward the heavens like steps for the gods to descend. But behind its glorious facades and golden walls, there pulsed a current of fear, whispers of sons who vanished, of mothers who screamed into the night, of ceremonies no outsider could witness and survive. The heart of Babylon was not its markets, nor even the palace of the king. It was the great temple of Vienna, devoted to Inanna, later called Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, fertility, and perhaps cruelty. To her, boys were given as offerings, not in blood, but in body, devotion, and sometimes their future. The ritual had a name few dared to speak aloud, the transition of the sacred youth. It began with signs. A boy was selected not for his strength, but for his beauty. Long lashes, delicate features, a voice still unbroken. If a priest noticed him in the market, perhaps dancing, singing, or simply walking with grace, he might whisper a word to the family, or he might not. A decree could arrive in the night, sealed with the temple's mark. The boy was chosen. Some families wept with pride, others with dread. What followed was unlike any coming of age in the ancient world. The boy was taken from his home at dawn and led through a hidden entrance behind the temple's southern altar. That was the last most ever saw of him. Inside, he was given new robes, soft, perfumed, unfamiliar, and a new name, one only the priests would call him. His hair was combed with sacred oils, his ears pierced with golden crescents. He was no longer a child, and yet no longer a boy either. He was a vessel, a living symbol of devotion to Inanna, whose myths told of transformation, duality, and sacrifice. The myth mattered. In one tale, Inanna descends into the underworld, stripping herself of power and clothing at each gate until she stands naked before her sister Ereshkigal. She dies and is reborn. The boys, too, had to pass through symbolic gates, 7 nights, 7 trials. In the first, they were made to fast and chant for hours in silence, wrapped in linen soaked in river clay. The temple walls echoed with their prayers as the priest circled, watching. A single mistake, and the day would start again. The second night was purification. Heated stones, sacred oils, cold water poured from the mouths of lion-headed jars. Then incense, thick, suffocating. The boy would lie awake, unable to breathe fully, hallucinating visions of the goddess. This, they said, was when her voice first entered his dreams. By the third night, he was not allowed to speak except in ritual phrases. If his real name was uttered, the entire ceremony was void, and he was sent away, marked and unclean. But few failed. The fear of shame, of divine wrath, of disappointing one's ancestors was too heavy. The fourth trial was of the body. The priests examined him, measured him, touched him. Not all could endure it. Not all returned from it unchanged. And then came the fifth night, the most secret, the most cruel. In the temple's innermost chamber, where no commoner had ever stepped foot, stood a dais carved from lapis lazuli and obsidian. Upon it, the boy would stand while the priestess recited verses from the Song of Inanna. Naked, trembling, arms outstretched like the goddess herself in her moment of rebirth. A blade was passed, not to harm, but to symbolize severance from the past. Sometimes it cut the hair, sometimes the skin, sometimes more. Outside, Babylon carried on. Lovers met in the shadows, merchants haggled, soldiers patrolled. None knew that beneath their feet, a ritual older than kings was breaking a boy into something new. The sixth night was silence, absolute. The boy was left alone in a chamber carved into the temple's foundation, lit only by a single flame. There he would wait until the dawn, listening to the voices of the gods, or his own fear, whichever arrived first. Some whispered that not all boys who entered this chamber emerged, that Inanna, if displeased, claimed them entirely. But those who survived were reborn. By the seventh night, they no longer wept. Their eyes were lined with kohl, their posture regal. They were introduced to the congregation not as boys, but as sacred beings, divine intermediaries, neither male nor female, beyond understanding. They danced in the festivals. They served wine to nobles. They whispered prophecies to those who paid enough. They were called Asinu, or Gala, or Kurgaru. The names shifted across centuries, but their purpose did not. They had been broken and remade, but not all rejoiced. Some, once released, disappeared into the alleys of the foreigners' quarter, wrapped in shame, begging to return to their families. Others never left the temple, aging behind the golden curtains, their eyes forever searching for the child they used to be. The city remembered them not, only the river did, and at dusk, when the wind was just right, it carried their songs, soft, high, aching, across the rooftops, over the gardens, through the gates, and into the dreams of mothers who had once kissed their sons goodbye. Not knowing, they were never coming back. By the time the stars had returned to their nightly stations, the boys who had vanished were no longer boys at all. Babylon, in all its brilliance, kept no record of their true names. In clay tablets etched by scribes with precision, they were listed only as attendants, dancers, dreamers. Yet in the silent corridors of the temple, their shadows stretched longer than any king's legacy. One such shadow belonged to a boy whose name had been Eridu, though even he had forgotten it. He had once chased beetles through the reeds by the riverbank, laughed with his cousins beneath the fig trees. His mother braided his hair in the mornings and called him my little star. Then one day, the priestess came in a boat gilded with bronze. She smiled, laid a garland of blue lotus on his shoulders, and said the goddess had whispered his name in a dream. He was taken before his voice had deepened. Inside the Iana temple, the rules of the outside world dissolved. Time did not pass in hours, but in incantations and echoes. The boys who were taken were forbidden to speak of their pasts. They were instructed to listen to the shuffle of feet, the low chants of eunuch singers, the secrets muttered in the baths beneath the earth. They learned to speak with their eyes, to serve wine without trembling, to dance like the goddess Inanna descending from the heavens. But not all of them adapted. There was a courtyard in the temple complex that no outsider knew of, enclosed by walls too high to scale and shaded by a sacred tamarisk tree. It was where the boys were tested, not by fire or blade, but by humiliation. They were dressed in veils, silks, and anklets, told to walk, speak, and move as though possessed by the goddess herself. Laughter from the elder priests meant failure. Silence meant survival. Those who failed too often were quietly sent away, not to their families, but to the lower districts, where they were never seen again. The ones who remained were bound to a different fate. Once transformed, the former boys were permitted to enter the sanctuary during sacred festivals. They were considered both pure and forbidden, touched by divinity, yet untouchable by mortal standards. During the Akidu festival, when Babylon rang with drums and incense and the king himself was humbled before the gods, the transformed youths led the processions. Their feet never touched the bare ground. Carpet of petals were laid before them. They bore torches, fans, and sacred emblems. Their eyes stared straight ahead, unmoved, unfazed, and yet inside many were breaking. One former initiate, whose name survives only in a fragment of cuneiform, Azu, was said to have fled the temple after 10 years of service. He shaved his head, wrapped himself in a merchant's cloak, and vanished into the southern districts. For years, his name was cursed in the temple, and yet whispered with awe in the alleys. He had escaped what few dared dream of escaping. Some said he wandered to the land of Elam. Others said he lived among the shepherds, dressed as a man, worked with his hands, and never again spoke of Babylon. But the temple was not just a prison. For some, it was the only place they ever knew love. Among the sacred attendants, bonds formed that no law recognized. 2 former boys, known only by their ritual names, Silatu and Amaruna, were said to have never left each other's side. During one festival, when Silatu collapsed from exhaustion, Amaruna tore the silk from his own robe to wipe his face and refused to dance without him. The priest scolded him, the congregation murmured, but no punishment followed. The goddess, they said, had smiled that day. Not all priests were cruel. Some saw in the boys a reflection of divine sorrow. One elderly scribe, whose stone tablet was found buried beneath the temple in a jar, wrote, "To take a child and offer him to the goddess is a theft of the soul. Yet the city demands it, and the gods accept it. May they forgive us." Outside the temple, whispers grew. Parents began to hide their sons at age 12. Some sent them away to relatives in distant villages. Others disguised them in rough clothes, rubbed ash on their cheeks to appear common, plain, undesired, but the temple had eyes everywhere. The goddess did not like to be denied. In the undercrofts of the temple, beneath the mosaics and alabaster pillars, were rooms where no sunlight entered. It was said the most beautiful among the chosen were kept there during their first days, to prepare, to pray, and sometimes simply to disappear. Those who emerged had a gaze that no longer belonged to children. They looked past things, through people, as if always seeing the gods. And yet, some did return. Rarely, after years of service, a former sacred youth was allowed to leave the temple and rejoin society. They were given a new name, a pouch of silver, and a sacred amulet to wear around their neck. But when they walked the streets, people turned away. Women clutched their children tighter. Men avoided their gaze. Because these were not ordinary men. They were seen as walking enigmas, part divine, part cursed, part memory of a ritual no one wanted to name. They never married. They never farmed. Most wandered. Some turned to prophecy, others to silence. One, known only as Tamuzi, would sit by the river each evening, carving tiny birds from cedarwood and setting them adrift. When asked why, he said softly, "For the boys who never came back." By the time a Babylonian boy turned 13, his fate was already sealed by whispers older than his bloodline. If he had soft features, a delicate voice, eyes too bright for comfort, there was always a priest who noticed, and in the temples, noticing was everything. They called it divine selection. But what it truly was ritualized disappearance. The city thrived on spectacle, and its most sacred spectacles demanded sacrifice, not of blood, but of self. These boys, taken at the cusp of youth, were not merely chosen for service. They were stripped of identity, adorned in symbolism, and woven into the mythic machinery that powered Babylon's spiritual life. They were no longer sons, they became vessels. The temples taught them to walk like the goddess Ishtar herself, to sway gently, to extend a hand in the air like a blessing. They were dressed in veils scented with frankincense. Their hair was oiled, curled, and draped down their backs. Their names, those given to them by their mothers, were burned in quiet ceremonies, and they were renamed after stars, birds, and forgotten rivers. The transformation was not physical alone, it was metaphysical. In the holiest shrines, the line between male and female blurred like incense smoke in the morning light. These former boys, now called Kurgaru or Asinu, were neither one nor the other. They danced in twilight, sang in tongues lost to ordinary men, and interpreted dreams said to come from the gods themselves. The priest whispered that the divine did not see gender, only purity, but purity had its price. Each festival season, the temple's gates opened and the city surged in. Nobles, merchants, and foreign dignitaries came to witness the processions. The sacred attendants led the ceremonies, eyes rimmed with black coal, garments shimmering with gold thread. They sang of divine love and cosmic suffering. They reenacted the goddess's descent into the underworld. And in the final moments, one among them would fall to their knees, sobbing, not in pretense, but in something raw, remembered, broken. It was all theater, but it was also truth. The pain of what they had lost clung to them like a second skin. One scroll, recovered from beneath the ruins of the Asagila temple, told of an initiate named Ninu. At 13, he was offered to the goddess. At 16, he was said to speak to spirits. At 20, he vanished during the festival of renewal. Some believed he drowned himself in the Euphrates. Others claimed he walked into the desert barefoot, smiling. His sandals were found near the edge of a ziggurat facing the sunrise. No body, no farewell, only silence. There was no rebellion in the temple, no uprising, only quiet disappearances, one after the other. A boy you shared bread with yesterday might be gone the next morning, his bed swept clean, his name no longer spoken. Some mothers went mad searching for their sons. One tale told of a woman named Ubara, who wept at the temple gates for 7 days. She sang lullabies, tore her garments, and offered her own hair to the goddess in exchange for her child. The priests ignored her, but the city remembered. A statue of a weeping woman appeared months later at a crossroads near the northern canal. No name on its base, only a carving of a lotus crushed underfoot. The silence surrounding these boys was deliberate. No Babylonian record ever called it exploitation. The rites were cloaked in sacred language, service, purity, devotion. But behind the columns of the temple and rooms lit by flickering oil lamps, there were boys who forgot how to smile, boys who flinched at loud voices, boys who learned to bow before they learned to read. They weren't merely hidden, they were erased. And yet, their presence lingered in strange ways. In street songs sung by children at dusk, verses hinted at, the ones who wear silk and speak like birds. In the dream journals of scribes, symbols often appeared. Eyes without mouths, sandals turned backwards, a golden hand reaching into water. The gods, it was said, kept no secrets forever. But Babylon was stubborn. The priests who oversaw these rites grew old and died. New ones took their place. The temple doors were repainted, the altars rebuilt. But the ritual, the quiet vanishing of chosen boys, persisted, because it was part of the city's rhythm, like the flow of the river or the turning of the stars. There were no heroes in this story, no avengers, only witnesses. A broken clay tablet found near Nippur held a fragment of a boy's last prayer. Let me wake as someone else. Let me be a reed in the river. Let me not remember. It was unsigned, but someone, somewhere, had tried to leave a trace, and Babylon, in all its beauty and cruelty, had tried to bury it. By the time the empire began to fracture, the practice had already hollowed out generations. The temples still stood, their ziggurats still touched the clouds, the gods still received offerings, but behind the incense and gold, something had begun to fade. Whispers filled the alleys, about boys taken and never seen again, about rituals that no longer felt divine, about songs that tasted of grief. Babylon was forgetting its own myth. The boys, those who vanished at 13, left behind more than silence. They left gaps in family lines, empty places at the dinner mat, broken threads in the city's memory. Fathers turned inward, mothers stared at the river, and siblings grew up knowing there were ghosts between them and the stars. One scribe, an old man by the time the Persian shadow loomed over the land, tried to capture what the priests would never write. His name was Bel-Iti. He had once served at the gate of Ishtar's temple. He had seen 13-year-olds led inside, trembling, their hair cut and redressed in gold. He remembered one boy in particular, a boy named Dumuzi, who had asked if he could keep a stone his sister gave him, a smooth river pebble. The priest had taken it and tossed it into the Euphrates. That boy, Bel-Iti recalled, never spoke again. Now, at the end of his life, Bel-Iti etched his memories onto the brittle clay with hands that trembled. He wrote not in the formal language of the priesthood, but in the broken script of sorrow. He wrote of songs sung at midnight, of hands held too tightly, of cries muffled behind temple walls. He wrote, "They said it was the will of the goddess, but I saw no goddess, only boys trying not to cry." His final tablet ended with a prayer, not to the gods, but to the lost. "Forgive us. We made you sacred, and in doing so, we made you vanish." It was buried with him in an unmarked grave, and yet the world moved on. The Persians arrived, then the Greeks. Empires rose and crumbled over the dust of Babylon's once golden stones. Temples were emptied, statues beheaded, ziggurats became nesting places for birds, and the sacred rites that once stole boys from their homes were forgotten by name, but not by shadow, because something lingered. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered fragments of jewelry far too ornate for children, buried alone deep beneath temple thresholds. They found bone combs, coal sticks, silken cords disintegrated to threads, and most haunting of all, altars stained not with blood, but with tears. And then there were the statues, not of gods, but of androgynous figures with downcast eyes, neither male nor female, lips parted as if whispering something the stone couldn't hold. Some had missing hands, some were cracked clean through the heart, but all wore the same expression, longing. Scholars puzzled over them, but none understood that these were echoes, not of divine beings, but of real children, once alive, once terrified, once silenced. And perhaps the most chilling trace of all was found on a faded mural, hidden behind the collapsed wall of a forgotten room in the ruins of Uruk. It showed a procession, young figures draped in veils, walking toward a figure too large for the space, a goddess towering and faceless. But in the background, painted so faintly it could almost be missed, was a single figure walking the other way, small, alone, and barefoot. A boy who did not want to be chosen, a boy who walked away. No one knew if it was historical or a quiet act of rebellion by a forgotten artist, but it was the only time in Babylonian sacred art that a child was shown escaping the ritual. One historian simply called it the boy who refused the gods, and in that single gesture, a painted footstep away from the divine, there was more truth than in 1,000 priestly hymns, because the question remained long after Babylon's fall. How many of those boys ever had a choice? How many were told that the divine wanted them, when in truth it was only men? And how many vanished before they had the words to ask why? The Euphrates flows still, muddy and slow, dragging secrets beneath its silt. Somewhere beneath that water, perhaps, lies a stone, a smooth, round river pebble, once held in the hand of a boy named Dumuzi. And somewhere in the silence between stars, there are voices that never forgot,